Sometimes people think losing someone means losing everything, because they confuse possession with connection, attention with love, and being chosen with being valuable. And that's where the story gets twisted. Especially when another person enters the picture, and suddenly you're watching someone you cared about move in a direction you never expected, wondering how someone else could take a place you thought was meant for you. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Nobody owns another human being, and no relationship title, spiritual label, or fantasy about destiny can guarantee that two people will stay together, because people make choices, sometimes beautiful ones, sometimes painful ones, and sometimes choices that leave someone else standing in the wreckage trying to understand what happened. While you may be tempted to believe that a third person somehow stole your connection, reality is usually more complicated than that, because a relationship can change for countless reasons: timing, communication, incompatibility, unresolved wounds, different priorities, or simply the fact that two people wanted different futures. And accepting that doesn't make your connection meaningless. It makes you honest about what a connection actually is. Something experienced by two people, rather than something one person can possess. While your mind may keep searching for signs that they secretly still belong to you, be careful, because longing can turn ordinary coincidences into evidence, and hope can become so powerful that it starts writing a story reality never promised. So instead of asking whether another person got their body, attention, or relationship status, ask what you actually learned from loving them. What did the experience reveal about your boundaries, your attachment, your expectations, your insecurities, and the kind of relationship you truly want? Because maybe the greatest lesson isn't that someone else couldn't take their soul, but that you were never supposed to measure your worth by whether someone stayed, and that realization can hurt like hell because it removes the fantasy of control. But it also gives you something better, your own freedom. While you stop competing with an imagined rival, you can finally stop turning another person's choices into a verdict on your value, because their decision is information about their life, not a final judgment about yours. And if they chose someone else, you can grieve that reality without humiliating yourself, chasing them, or convincing yourself that every silence contains a secret message. While you rebuild your own life, you begin understanding that genuine love doesn't require ownership, obsession, or constant proof. It requires honesty, consent, mutual effort, and the freedom for both people to choose each other willingly. And if that choice disappears, forcing the connection to continue doesn't preserve love. It preserves attachment. While the pain slowly becomes clearer, you may realize that what you miss isn't only the person, but the future you imagined with them, the version of yourself you became around them, and the possibility that everything would eventually make sense. And losing those things can feel like losing an entire universe. But universes can be rebuilt, identities can be rebuilt, dreams can be rebuilt, and sometimes the life waiting beyond the relationship is larger than the life you were desperately trying to preserve. While you stop asking who won and who lost, you can start asking whether you are becoming someone you respect, someone who can love deeply without abandoning himself, someone who can experience rejection without turning it into hatred, and someone who can accept uncertainty without inventing supernatural explanations to make the pain easier to understand. Because you don't need to believe that someone else's soul secretly belongs to you in order for your experience to have mattered, and you don't need their return to prove that what you felt was real. Sometimes something can be real and still end. Sometimes two people can change each other and still walk separate paths. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is let the relationship become part of your history, instead of forcing it to remain part of your future, while you carry the lessons forward, leaving behind the need to possess what you loved and keeping the wisdom that love revealed about you, your boundaries, your needs, your capacity to care, and your ability to stand alone without becoming empty. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. People have a strange habit of confusing love with ownership, as if feeling deeply for someone automatically gives them a permanent claim over that person's choices, attention, future, and heart. And the moment another person appears, the mind starts creating a competition. Who took them? Who won? Who lost? Who deserves them? Who doesn't? As though two human beings have suddenly become pieces on a board. But real connection doesn't work like that. No matter how intense it felt. No matter how many memories you shared. No matter how certain you once were that this person was meant to remain beside you. Because another human being is not property, and neither are you. Which means their choices can hurt you without becoming a statement about your value. While attachment can make everything feel like evidence, a delayed message becomes a secret sign. A familiar song becomes destiny. An unexpected meeting becomes proof that the universe is pulling you back together. And suddenly, you're building an entire theory around moments that may have ordinary explanations, because the mind hates uncertainty and will often invent a story simply to avoid accepting that something is unknown. But if you really want clarity, you have to be willing to tolerate uncertainty. You have to say, I don't know what they feel. I don't know what they will choose. And I don't know what the future holds, without immediately filling those empty spaces with assumptions, because that is where emotional freedom begins. While you may believe another person has somehow taken your connection away, ask yourself what exactly was taken. Your memories weren't taken. Your growth wasn't taken. The lessons weren't taken. And the person you became through the experience wasn't taken either. Because those things are part of your story now, regardless of who they choose to spend their time with. And that can be painful to accept, because it means you cannot control the ending simply because the beginning felt extraordinary. But love that requires control isn't freedom. It's fear wearing the costume of devotion. While you stop measuring your relationship against the presence of a third person, you begin seeing the situation more honestly. Maybe they made a choice you don't understand. Maybe they changed. Maybe the relationship had problems you didn't see. Maybe circumstances shifted. Or maybe the connection simply wasn't sustainable in the way you imagined. And none of those possibilities make you worthless. They simply remind you that relationships involve two independent people with separate minds, needs, histories, and decisions. While your heart may demand a dramatic explanation, because dramatic explanations feel easier than uncertainty, choose the explanation supported by reality, not the one that gives you the most emotional satisfaction, because believing that someone secretly belongs to you can keep you trapped in waiting, watching, interpreting, and hoping, while their actual life continues without your permission or approval. And that's a terrible bargain, because you're giving away your present to protect an imagined future, while the healthier question becomes, what kind of love do I want to participate in? A relationship where both people openly choose each other, communicate honestly, respect boundaries, and put in mutual effort. Not one where you're constantly trying to decode hidden messages or prove that a spiritual label makes the relationship inevitable, because meaningful connection doesn't need mythology to become meaningful. If it was real to you, it mattered, and you don't have to turn it into destiny to justify the emotions you experienced. While you release the need to possess the connection, you can finally appreciate what it taught you without demanding that it continue forever. And that is a much more mature form of love, one that can say, I cared about you deeply, and I still respect your freedom to choose. Even when that choice hurts, while you learn to separate love from possession, you also stop treating yourself as something that can be replaced, because people aren't interchangeable objects. Your value doesn't disappear because someone else entered a relationship, and their decision doesn't create a ranking system where their new partner becomes superior and you become inferior. Because attraction, compatibility, timing, and choice are complicated human realities, not mathematical scores that determine who deserves to feel worthy. While you continue rebuilding your perspective, you may discover that the most important relationship you neglected during all that searching was the one you have with yourself, because you were so focused on whether someone else would return that you stopped asking whether the version of you waiting for them was actually living, growing, creating, and becoming stronger. And that question can change everything. Because once you stop trying to possess what you cannot control, you have energy again, energy to build your life, strengthen your standards, deepen healthy relationships, and become someone who can love without disappearing inside the love. While the past remains meaningful, it no longer has to become a cage. Because connection can be honored without being worshipped. Memories can be respected without becoming predictions, and love can be real without becoming a claim on another person's future, leaving you with the freedom to care deeply while still allowing both people to remain fully human, fully independent, and completely responsible for their own choices. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. It hurts when someone you deeply cared about chooses somebody else, especially when you believed the connection was rare, powerful, or somehow meant to last, because the mind immediately starts asking the cruelest questions. What did they have that I didn't? Why wasn't I enough? What did I do wrong? And why could they give someone else the place I thought belonged to me? But here's the trap. You're turning another person's choice into a measurement of your own worth. And those are two completely different things. Because someone can choose a different relationship without that decision proving that you are less attractive, less intelligent, less lovable, or somehow inferior. People make relationship decisions for hundreds of reasons: compatibility, timing, emotional readiness, shared values, circumstances, attraction, communication, personal history, and sometimes reasons even they don't fully understand. So reducing all of that to, they chose them because they are better than me, is not clarity. It's self-punishment disguised as an explanation. While you compare yourself to another person, you're usually comparing your private insecurities with the version of them you can see from the outside. You don't know what happens behind closed doors. You don't know their challenges. You don't know the entire relationship. And you don't know what the future will bring. Yet your mind can create an imaginary competition where you are constantly losing, even though nobody agreed to participate in that competition. And that's how comparison quietly steals your confidence. Because instead of asking whether you are living according to your own values, you start asking whether you are better than someone else. While those questions may feel connected, they lead to completely different lives. One creates growth, the other creates obsession. Because if your worth depends on being chosen over somebody else, you will always be vulnerable to rejection, and every relationship becomes an audition. Every attractive person becomes a threat. Every change in attention becomes a crisis. And every breakup becomes evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with you. But you are not a product waiting for a customer to select you from a shelf. You are a human being with your own character, flaws, strengths, values, and direction. While you learn that distinction, rejection can still hurt without destroying your identity. You can admit, I wanted this person to choose me, without adding, therefore I am not worthy. Because desire and worth are not the same thing, and another person's decision cannot calculate your value for you. While someone moves on, you may feel replaced. But people are not replaceable objects. A new relationship doesn't erase what you experienced, and it doesn't transform your memories into lies. It simply means circumstances changed and another person is now making choices that belong to them. While you grieve, allow yourself to feel the disappointment without turning it into a lifelong identity, because sadness is a normal response to loss. but staying permanently focused on proving that you deserve them keeps your life centered on someone else's decision. And you deserve more than that. While you rebuild your confidence, focus on the parts of yourself that actually belong to you: your health, your discipline, your work, your friendships, your creativity, your boundaries, your emotional maturity, and your ability to make choices that respect the person you want to become, because those things don't depend on whether someone texts you back, returns to you, regrets leaving, or realizes what they lost. And that independence is important, because when your self-worth stops depending on external selection, you become freer to love without begging, communicate without performing, and walk away when the relationship no longer respects your needs. While you may still hope they return someday, be honest about that hope without building your entire life around it, because hope can exist without becoming a waiting room. You can leave the door emotionally unlocked while continuing to live your actual life. But don't confuse possibility with probability, and don't turn uncertainty into a promise, because the future isn't obligated to match the story you imagined. While you stop competing with the third person, you begin recognizing that your real competition was never them. It was the version of yourself that believed another person's choice could determine your value, and defeating that belief is far more meaningful than defeating an imagined rival, because once you understand your worth isn't awarded by someone else's decision, you can experience rejection without begging for validation, heartbreak without losing your identity, and change without assuming you have somehow become less valuable. While the relationship may have ended, changed, or moved in another direction, your capacity to grow hasn't ended, your ability to love hasn't ended, and your future hasn't been canceled, because one person's choice can close one door without defining the entire building, leaving you with the difficult but liberating task of choosing yourself without pretending you never wanted anyone else to choose you. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. Your mind can become a brilliant storyteller when reality refuses to give you the ending you wanted, because uncertainty feels unbearable. So the brain starts collecting tiny details and turning them into a grand explanation, a message arriving at the right time, a song appearing unexpectedly, seeing the person's name somewhere, dreaming about them, noticing a strange coincidence, and suddenly every ordinary event becomes a secret signal pointing toward the future you desperately want. But here's the uncomfortable part. A coincidence can be meaningful to you without being proof of destiny, and a feeling can be powerful without being evidence, because emotions tell you what you're experiencing, not necessarily what is happening inside another person's mind while you are trying to understand a complicated relationship. That distinction becomes incredibly important, because if you treat every feeling as fact, you can build an entire reality around assumptions, and once that reality feels emotionally convincing, contradictory information becomes difficult to accept. You start explaining away silence, rationalizing distance, and interpreting every small interaction as hidden evidence that the connection is still secretly alive, while the actual person may simply be living their life and making choices you cannot see. And that's why clarity requires you to separate what you know from what you hope, what happened from what you interpreted, and what someone directly communicated from what you believe they secretly meant, because those categories are not interchangeable. If they tell you they want distance, that's information. If they openly choose another relationship, that's information. If they communicate clearly that they don't want contact, that's information. And no amount of symbolic interpretation should be used to override a person's direct words and boundaries, because respecting reality also means respecting other people's autonomy. While your mind may want a more dramatic explanation, sometimes the simplest explanation is simply that people change, feelings change, circumstances change, and relationships don't always follow the emotional script we wrote for them. And accepting that doesn't mean the connection was fake. It means you're allowing reality to be more complicated than the fantasy. While you learn to question the story in your head, don't attack yourself for having hope. Hope is human, longing is human, and attachment is human, but you don't have to turn those feelings into predictions. You can say, I miss them. Without saying, therefore they must be thinking about me, you can say, this coincidence feels strange. Without saying, therefore the universe is sending me a message. And you can say, I still love them? Without saying, therefore we're destined to reunite. Because those extra conclusions are interpretations, not facts. While this may sound less romantic than believing every sign has a hidden meaning, it is actually more empowering. Because when you stop searching the universe for permission to move forward, you realize you can make decisions based on reality. You can grieve when something ends, establish boundaries when necessary, communicate directly when appropriate, and continue living without needing a supernatural explanation for every unanswered question while you separate reality from the story. You also protect yourself from emotional manipulation, because people can sometimes use vague promises, mixed signals, or spiritual language to keep someone waiting indefinitely. And if a person genuinely wants a relationship with you, their actions should eventually communicate that clearly, not leave you trapped in an endless puzzle where you have to decode every silence. While healthy connection requires communication, consistency, mutual effort, and respect, not constant detective work. And if you're always trying to figure out what someone really means because they refuse to communicate clearly, the uncertainty itself is important information. While your heart may still want to believe that everything has a hidden purpose, you can allow yourself to appreciate the meaning you personally found without claiming that meaning proves something about another person's future choices. Because personal meaning and objective evidence are different things, and keeping them separate protects your peace. While you stop chasing signs, you can start noticing something far more useful, your own patterns. Why are you drawn toward uncertainty? Why does waiting feel safer than accepting an ending? Why does ambiguity feel more exciting than clarity? And why are you willing to interpret tiny signals instead of asking direct questions or accepting direct answers? Because sometimes the mystery isn't about the other person at all. It's about what you're avoiding inside yourself. While you become honest about that, you gain a different kind of power, the power to stop turning uncertainty into obsession, the power to accept that you may never know exactly what someone else feels, and the power to build your next decision around what you actually know instead of what you desperately hope is true. Because reality may not give you the dramatic explanation your heart wanted, but it can give you something better, a solid foundation from which you can finally decide what deserves your attention, your energy, and your future. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. Sometimes the hardest thing to accept is that a painful experience can be valuable without needing to become an obsession. Because when someone leaves your life, your mind may keep returning to the same questions. What happened? What did I miss? What could I have done differently? What are they thinking now? Are they coming back? And why did everything change? And those questions can feel like you're searching for closure. But there is a point where searching stops being useful and becomes another way of staying attached to what already happened. Because you can spend months analyzing every conversation, every message, every photograph, every silence, and still not discover an answer that satisfies your heart. While the lesson may have been sitting quietly inside the experience the entire time, asking you to look at yourself rather than endlessly examine someone else. Maybe the relationship showed you that you ignore your own boundaries when you fear losing someone. Maybe it revealed how much external validation affects your confidence. Maybe you discovered that you confuse intensity with compatibility, or maybe you realized that you were giving more effort than you were receiving, and those realizations can hurt because they force you to become honest about patterns you would rather romanticize. But honesty is where growth begins, because you can't change a pattern you refuse to see while you examine the experience. Don't turn every painful memory into evidence that you were foolish for caring. Caring deeply isn't stupidity. Trusting someone isn't automatically weakness, and wanting a future with someone doesn't make you naive. But you can still learn to become more selective about who receives your trust, how quickly you attach, what behavior you tolerate, and what standards you maintain when your emotions become intense. Because love should not require you to abandon yourself just to keep someone close. And if an experience teaches you that lesson, then the experience gave you something valuable, even if you never received the ending you wanted. While you stop obsessing over whether another person secretly regrets leaving, you can start asking whether you regret abandoning your own needs. And that question can be far more revealing, because sometimes heartbreak isn't only about losing someone. It's about realizing how much of yourself you sacrificed while trying to keep the relationship alive. And that's where the rebuilding begins, not by becoming cold, but by becoming more aware, more honest, and more protective of your own values. While the temptation to check their social media, interpret their behavior, or search for signs of their return appears, remind yourself that observation isn't connection. Watching someone from a distance doesn't create intimacy, and decoding their behavior doesn't give you control over their choices. While you redirect that energy toward yourself, you create room for things that actually respond to your effort. Your goals, your friendships, your work, your creativity, your health, and your emotional growth, because those areas can improve when you invest in them. While another person's feelings remain outside your control, and that's an important lesson. Because you cannot build a stable life around variables you cannot control. While you take the lesson instead of the obsession, you begin seeing the relationship as one part of your story, rather than the entire story. You can appreciate the good moments without pretending the bad ones didn't exist. Acknowledge your mistakes without turning them into permanent shame. And remember the person without making your future dependent on their return. Because healing doesn't require forgetting. It requires changing your relationship with the memory, so the memory can exist without controlling your behavior. While you continue learning, you may become better at recognizing unhealthy dynamics earlier, communicating your needs more clearly, leaving when your boundaries are repeatedly ignored, and choosing relationships based on mutual effort rather than emotional chaos, because intensity can feel like destiny when you're inside it. But stability often reveals itself more quietly through consistency, respect, communication, and the absence of constant confusion. While you understand that difference, you stop chasing emotional storms simply because they feel powerful, and you start valuing peace without mistaking peace for boredom. While the past may still hurt sometimes, that doesn't mean you're going backward. It means you're human. And healing rarely moves in a perfectly straight line. But every time you choose not to reopen an old wound, just to see if it still hurts, every time you resist the urge to search for another sign, and every time you return your attention to your own life, you're teaching yourself that the past can be remembered without being obeyed. While the experience remains part of you, it no longer has to run your decisions. Because the goal isn't to erase what happened, it's to extract the wisdom, keep the self-respect, release the obsession, and carry forward only what helps you become more emotionally mature, more grounded, and more capable of building a relationship where love doesn't require you to lose yourself. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. There comes a moment when you have to stop asking whether someone will come back, asking whether you are willing to come back to yourself. Because it's incredibly easy to spend your days waiting for another person's decision, while pretending you're simply being patient. You check your phone, revisit old conversations, look for signs, imagine future reunions, and quietly build your entire emotional world around a possibility that may or may not happen. And the strangest part is that you can become so attached to the possibility that you forget to notice how much of your actual life you're sacrificing for it. Because waiting feels safer than moving forward. If you keep waiting, you never have to fully accept the loss, never have to confront the empty space, and never have to answer the uncomfortable question of what your life looks like without that person. But eventually you have to face it, because another person's return cannot be the foundation of your identity, your peace, or your future. While you release control, you're not saying the relationship meant nothing. You're not declaring that you never loved them, and you're not pretending that losing them didn't hurt. You're simply accepting that their choices belong to them, just as your choices belong to you, and that separation of responsibility can feel brutal at first because it removes the illusion that you can somehow think, hope, pray, or analyze your way into controlling another person's heart. But it also gives you your freedom back. Because once you understand that you cannot control whether someone returns, you can stop organizing your entire life around making that return happen. While you rebuild yourself, start with ordinary things, get your routines back, take care of your responsibilities, reconnect with people who make you feel like yourself, work toward goals that existed before the relationship became the center of your attention, and create days that contain meaning even when nobody from your past is watching. Because healing becomes real when your life starts feeling valuable, without requiring someone else's presence to validate it. While you may still miss them, let the feeling exist without turning it into an instruction. Missing someone doesn't mean you should contact them. Loving someone doesn't mean you should chase them. And remembering someone doesn't mean you're required to remain emotionally available forever. Because emotions are information, not commands. While you become more independent emotionally, you also become more selective. You start asking whether future relationships are built on mutual effort, honest communication, respect, consistency, and freedom rather than constant uncertainty, obsession, and emotional guessing games. Because you don't want to spend another chapter trying to convince someone to choose you. You want a relationship where choosing each other is clear through actions. While your attention returns to your own life, something unexpected happens. The person you were waiting for slowly becomes less central, not because you suddenly stopped caring, but because you finally started caring about yourself with the same intensity. And that's when the balance changes, because your happiness is no longer hanging from another person's decision. While you continue growing, don't make the mistake of turning self-improvement into another performance designed to make someone regret losing you. Because then you're still living for their reaction, still checking whether they noticed, still measuring your progress by their response. Instead, improve because you want to respect yourself, become stronger because you want a stronger life, build confidence because you want to trust your own decisions, and create peace because you are tired of living inside emotional chaos. While the possibility of reconciliation may remain somewhere in the future, you don't have to chase it or destroy it. You can simply let reality reveal what happens. Because if two people genuinely want to reconnect, that requires clear communication and mutual action. Not endless guessing, hidden signs, or one person carrying the entire emotional burden. And if they never return, your life still has somewhere to go. Because your future was never supposed to be held hostage by one person's choice. While you release the need to know exactly what they feel, you create space to discover what you feel, what you want, what you value, and what kind of person you want to become after everything you've experienced. And those questions are much more important than endlessly trying to read someone else's mind, because your life is happening now, not in the imagined reunion, not in the old conversation, not in the memory of what could have been, but in the choices you make today. And every time you choose yourself without becoming bitter, every time you accept reality without surrendering hope, and every time you move forward without needing anyone to validate the direction, you become less trapped by the past and more available to the life that is actually waiting for you, carrying the lessons of the connection without carrying the burden of needing it to return.